to start, let's talk about some of the key terms that we're talking about today. The word menstruation comes from the Latin word menses, meaning month, and the Greek word mean, which means moon. And in ancient times, people believed that the menstrual cycle was connected to the moon, both because the cycles are about 29 days long. This is also very interesting, that the word vagina is really kind of unknown in its etymology, but Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, referred to it as the shameful parts. And there's other words that, it's thought to be the sheath for a sword. But, I think that this is why conversations like this need to exist, so that because there's really nothing to be ashamed of. We need to promote an open dialogue around pelvic health.
Hello. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the visual side of women throughout our history. And this image is by Hans Baldung Green, who was an assistant to Albrecht Dürer, who most people know as being a very, very famous artist from the late 1400s. And Baldung, this image is from the early 1500s, I think around 1511 or 1512. It's in the back of the references if you want to have the exact date. And it was made for a New Year's Eve drawing for a priest. And the reason why this is so fascinating is that this was the time of Martin Luther. So this was a very particularly humanist, like a revolution in terms of understanding kind of freedoms of the human mind. And then the Gutenberg Bible was just happening around the same time. And the Gutenberg Bible was the first mass-produced book that was bought widely. And the second most popular published book at the time was How to Kill a Witch. And so it's very important to see the correlation between these two things, between this amazing artist who consciously decided to do this depiction of witches, which at that point did not really actually exist art historically. Women that were frightening as midwives and powerful female presences were not witches until this time. And the reason why that is because learned men liked this image of them as being sexy and dangerous. And so they were actually selling this to each other, knowing that it's not real and it's kind of made up, but at the same time, other people started to believe it was real. And then it started to affect midwives and started to change the way people saw these women that were very powerful in these communities. And so this is also an important image because it's showing the crone, which is the old woman who has gone through menopause, and how she is actually the one who is the instigator of these younger women. And so the theory is that when you stopped having your period, your menstruation was so powerful that it was evil, and that women were sent into huts to have their periods, or they would poison the community. But when an old woman stopped menstruating, she was the most evil because the menstrual blood didn't leave her body. It filled up inside of her body, and she could look at you and shoot poison from her eyes because the menstruation was still inside. And so there's all these amazing things that I've been researching over the years from this image. And then the other image of the younger woman looking out from underneath and turning over and glancing at her through her eyes is that there was also a power about a witch looking at you from her underneath, looking down, because she's basically entrancing you as a man. So it's a very powerful image, and I was very taken with this, and my husband actually, who's an artist, was the one who first started to show me these images by Hans Baldwin Green, and it means Hans of the Green or something. It's kind of it's a euphemism for what his real name was, and he's someone to look at if you're interested in understanding the history of witches in art history. And then the next image is my version, which is a sculpture. And right now I'm in the middle of making this sculpture, which I made in wood in my studio, and now I'm making it in a foundry in Queens this week in bronze. So it's going to be life-size. And the way I made it is I made a drawing of the original drawing, and I cut up the drawing and turned it into a paper model that was this big, and then I changed it into this wood version in my own studio, which is down on Canal Street. So I've been doing this for 30 years now.
And this work is called Metal Storm.
Yes.
And if you can look at the shapes, you can see them reflected from the previous image.
Yes.
Most notably, the nipple of the crone is like one identifiable feature.
And the eyes.
And the eyes from underneath. And then I love the sort of the torch that is sort of showing women as victorious. So what I loved about Rachel's work is she took this old image of something that was sort of controlling women and repurposed it as something as victorious. So I really love how you had that juxtaposed.
That's how we had our bonding.
And this is how it was born, is our relationship. So, and this was the piece that actually really brought us together.
Yes.
So I'm going to go through a brief timeline as best as I can. So basically, the history of women's health highlights both progress and setbacks, and progress is seen in green and setbacks are seen in red. And they show that change is often a staggered process rather than a smooth, linear trajectory. This is not inclusive of all events. I do not claim to be a historian. I just wanted to bring together some interesting details about women's health and their history to help, set the conversation. So in the 1800s, just as an extension of what Rachel was saying, we had women-centered care in childbirth for many, many years and in many countries. But in the U.S., this type of mentorship was actually done through apprenticeship. And so women were teaching women about the birthing process. But the rise of obstetric medicine shifted childbirth to a male-dominated medicalized process, representing an early setback for women's control over women's health. Now, by the mid-20th century, there was significant progress being made in medicine, and there were some real male champions of women's health, notably Dr. Arnold Kegel, who developed exercises to enhance postpartum health. And he created the perionometer as well, which is a tool that's used to help measure vaginal strength. Although pioneered by a male, it was his commitment to women's health, especially during the postpartum period, that has really endured over these decades. And we now use the Kegel exercise even till this day. And we're going to be talking about the Kegel later on today as we do one together. Similarly, in the 1950s, Margaret Sanger, her advocacy for the birth control pill marked a major breakthrough for reproductive autonomy. But again, the pill was faced with considerable resistance. Many states banned the pill for married women. And the only way that a married woman in certain states could get the pill was under the guise that it was to help regulate her period. And so women really still lacked control over their reproductive health. In states that they did allow it, women were able to get it, but again, under certain restrictions. Additionally, early versions of the pill had issues with health. Basically had problems with dosage. The high dosage in hormones led to concerns over risks for blood clots and strokes. So, but I want to say, interestingly, the birth control pill, which was derived from nature, its key ingredient is actually Barbasco, which is contains progestin in it. It's a wild yam. And Mexican women during and all the way dating back to the Aztecs were using this Barbasco root to help regulate their own periods. So women sort of were figuring out their own way. I thought that was really interesting. Enovit eventually became approved and hit the market in 1960. But again, there was a lot of governmental pushback. There are bans in countries like Norway and the Soviet Union due to safety concerns. Rightfully so. Those pills were in such high doses that they were at risk for women. And then in 1962, which was a huge setback for women, there was the thalidomide crisis, and the thalidomide drug was used to combat nausea for pregnant women, and this ended up harming countless women and their fetuses and their children, and it sort of underscored the lack of adequate drug safety for women. And there's always sort of like this pressure to research or to protect, and this is why you see these pushes and pulls through the timeline. This was also, the thalidomide crisis was also the precursor to the removal of reproductive women from the clinical trial in 1977, which you'll see in the next slide. As we progress forward, I bring up two important key events. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed that allowed Black, Indigenous, and women of color to vote, which was a huge step forward for women. And also the legal case, Griswold versus Connecticut, finally allowed married women to obtain the birth control pill, and I believe that was the case that ended up allowing constitutional rights over the birth control pill. So despite setbacks, there were also steps forward to help support health and autonomy for women. So as we see in 1977, the removal of reproductive women from the clinical trial was really sort of a tough point, because women were really not reintroduced back into the clinical trial until 1993. That is a 17-year gap in reproductive women being entered into a clinical trial. So just think about what that 17-year gap does for research and for women later on. In the same period, in 1990, the American with Disabilities Act was marked by progress for women with disabilities. This becomes really important later when we discuss urinary incontinence and fecal incontinence, because these are a disability for women. In 2003, another sort of setback was the NIH study, which was called the Women's Health Initiative. I'm not sure if it was really much of an initiative when it led to hormone replacement therapy becoming really feared as a prescription from medical doctors to their patients, because it was associated with high cancer rates and mortality rates. And because of the fear and the hype and the media hype around that study, there was a dramatic reduction in the use of hormone replacement therapy for women from 25% to just 4%. Fast forward, I'm moving through time very quickly, ladies. Fast forward to 2020, the election of the first female and woman of color, Kamala Harris, as Vice President of the United States in 2020 was really a milestone for women leadership. Despite your politics, to have a woman and a woman of color in the executive office was a feat, having some voice and having representation. 2 years later, however, in 2022, the Supreme Court's reversal of Roe v. Wade, which was put into place in 1973, had been a constitutional right to abortion, and this was rolled back to state legislature. Despite your viewpoint, again, this reversal did limit the access to safe and legal abortions. I kind of wanted to end it up on a high note. I feel like that was sort of important. In 2023, this was the year that Claudia Golden, a woman, a single recipient, female recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, was awarded to her, and it recognized her research on women's participation in the workforce over 200 years. So we'll have to wait to see what 2024 will bring to us.
So this is another Hans Baldwin Green image that started a whole kind of theory of my own that I haven't been able to realize yet, but it's called the 7 Ages of Woman. It's basically one woman's lifespan, from a baby to an old woman, And it's something that I've thought about as an art form, and I was working with Gucci to actually do a performance piece for the LA County Museum a couple years ago, pre-COVID, so now it's more than a couple years. But it would be each of these ages of a woman in the form of a parade float. And then they'd have the models come out on each parade float. So it'd be the baby parade, the pre-menopausal young adolescent girl, then the Venus fertility goddess, the young mother, then the middle-aged mother, and then the older woman period. And I just thought that would be really beautiful, and I had all these things mapped up. So this is a really important image in terms of showing, I think, my idea of what Hans Baldung really believed versus the idea of the sex selling. This is more of a humanitarian approach. And in this piece I made, it's called The Bleeding Shepherdess. And when I was at college, I was actually a religion and philosophy major, and I studied a book called Of Purity and Danger by a woman named Mary, I'm blanking out on her name, but she's very important sociology professor who wrote about the idea of the Puritans coming to America and being freaked out by the filth, that there were animals and there were dirty huts and people were living with their animals in these huts, and that you can correlate that same freak out about women's bodies, that women are not able to control their menstruation and their pregnancies, and that they're tied to the earth in a way that men aren't. So I was fascinated with Marie Antoinette and why she would dress up as a shepherdess when everybody is, like basically dying of poverty, and she's dressing up as a shepherdess. And it was this fantasy of someone who lived with the animals and with the earth, but it was a fantasy. It was all a make-believe. So I made this sculpture based on all those thoughts. And her dress is basically bleeding. It's got this like vaginal fold inside the dress that has blood coming out of it, but then she's a fantasy of a shepherdess. So that's where that.
And what year was this, Rachel?
2000. This is where I'm terrible with dates and names, but this was, I think, right around the time I was having children for the first time.
Probably
so
like
2002, 2003, somewhere around there, yeah.
Okay. So we'll be moving on to the key periods of the period. Some interesting points to think about is that the average woman will spend 450 menstrual cycles throughout her lifetime. That's 13 to 18 cycles per year. That's 3,500 days of menstruating, which adds up to 10 years.
Isn't that? That's amazing.
Wow.
Wow.
10 years of bleeding time.
Wow.
We also know, we call it bleeding time, we've called it the rag, we call it when Aunt Flo is visiting. So there's all these names that we've assigned to this sort of phase. And we're gonna present sort of 3 key points during the entire menstrual lifespan. And that is menarche and early menses. Menarche means your first period. Fertility and birth, and menopause. So the female menstrual cycle is a vital sign. I just love thinking about that term because it's so clear to us who have menstruated that it really does give us valuable information. So there are 2 key ways to look at the menstrual cycle as being a vital sign. The first way is to look at when a girl first initiates her period, so the age at which she initiates her period, called menarche, and how long it takes her to regulate her period. That's one approach to looking at how those 2 data points might predict future health outcomes. The second way is to look at each menstrual cycle as a vital sign throughout your life, and how your menstrual cycle can offer you feedback on your reproductive, hormonal, and just your general health overall. So tracking both can help identify health issues early and ensure better long-term wellness. So I'm going to kind of dive into each a little bit. So the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology published a report, and they said that it is important to monitor when a girl first gets her period and how long it takes to regulate. And it can take up to 2 years, 2 to 4 years to regulate her period. And there was a big study done in 2020 that looked at 55 years of data over in the US as a retrospective cohort study. And they found that girls from racial and ethnic minority groups, including Blacks, Asians, Hispanics, and multiracial girls, tended to experience menarche early and took longer to reach cycle regularity compared to Caucasian girls. And that body mass index was a really key predictor. So as a physical therapist, this is a time when we can really enact our skill set and where we have, because if girls are now getting their periods earlier and it's taking them a longer time to regulate, well, we need to look at resources like fitness, nutrition, access to healthy food as options and ways to teach these young girls to help them get on track. And I think that now that girls are getting their menstrual cycles earlier, we can't use the birth control pill unless it's for birth control reasons, because it shouldn't be, it's not that it's not a good idea to use. If it's necessary, medications are important. But I think we need to look at fitness and nutrition as the first line of approach when dealing with young girls that are starting to menstruate, in order to help them regulate more quickly and improve their health outcomes down the line. It was interesting because the age 12 is considered the mean age when a girl will menstruate and will begin menstruation. And when you looked at international data, girls that were menstruating before and that were menstruating earlier than the age of 12 were associated with overnutrition issues, such as and chronic diseases, whereas girls that are menstruating later were really looking at undernutrition issues and an implication to infectious diseases as a part of their chronic health history. So it's really interesting to look at the BMI and how it pertains to first for menarche and time to regularity. Another sort of point is to think about with menarche and time to regularity is just allowing to track data, really, is that we don't really have a lot of data. I think this was a really interesting study that came out, but we still need to continue that purpose. The other way to think about your menstrual cycle is as a window into your health as when you're getting it regularly. So every menstrual cycle as a vital sign. Paula Hillard, the MD at Stanford University, really kind of coined this term and really established that the menstrual cycle is your 6th vital sign, next to oxygenation, body temperature, heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate. So it's really important to teach young girls how to evaluate their discharge. And so this is something that we start to do when we become interested in fertility. We start looking at our discharge to know when we're ovulating for the purposes of getting pregnant. But this is something that we can be teaching to young girls right away so that they can gauge their own health as it's happening. It's kind of like a wearable. I also want to bring up PMS symptoms. There are physiological processes that are occurring with PMS that we know of, but I also wanted to bring up this sort of the cultural beliefs around PMS. Like I could get into an argument with my brother and have a valid point, and he could be like, "Oh, you're probably just PMSing." I'm like, "Well, maybe it's actually valid, and I'm not irritable, and I'm just right." And so there are ways to think about how we're teaching our young girls to have the right imagery when we're thinking about PMS and menstrual symptoms. So how do cultural beliefs about PMS impact young females? Well, words that come up often are like depressed, hidden, ashamed of lack of productivity, low energy, irritable, painful. But I think that we need to start to dialogue some of these, the differences we need to dialogue these symptoms in a more positive light. So instead of depressed, maybe deep rest. Instead of hidden, free from burden. Instead of ashamed of lack of productivity, inwardly productive. Instead of low energy, maybe putting energy towards a life force. Instead of irritable, maybe allowing ourselves to feel. And it can be painful in both circumstances, but there's a negative view and a positive view. And so what image do we want to give to our young females?
So this is an image by Lucas Cranach, who is roughly around the same time as Durer and Baldung. And I chose this because it's the image of charity. But it's obviously a mother and her children. So there's another version that's called Italian charity, which is actually a man that is an old man in prison who is being fed from the breast milk of a younger woman. It's the weirdest, creepiest image, but it's the idea that mothers have learned to be all giving and all life and supporting other lives and giving themselves to support other life. And I thought this was just a very beautiful, kind image to begin our discussion of motherhood.
So birthing in the pelvic floor. I think this is a really profound statement. To have the greatest impact on public health, we must prioritize the health and well-being of mothers, ensuring that a woman is healthy physically, mentally, and emotionally postpartum. And we have a postpartum mommy in the audience today. If we are taking care of that woman postpartum, it is not only crucial for her own recovery, but also for the health and development of her child. Research shows that improving a mother's well-being directly enhances the mother-child bond, which positively influences the child's health outcomes during the first 5 years of life and beyond. So this is a very critical time to have the greatest impact on public health. When it comes to childbirth, the best outcomes for the mother, I always say to my patients, is a vaginal delivery with minimal tearing. It allows for faster recovery and a lower risk of complications. But severe tearing during vaginal birth can lead to pelvic floor dysfunction, pelvic organ prolapse, urinary incontinence, fecal incontinence, and flatulence incontinence, all of which can have a long-lasting impact on a woman's quality of life later on. The most predictable outcome, on the other hand, is a C-section, which, while sometimes necessary, carries its own sets of challenges of recovery. So there is really no good option. Talk about birth control. Okay. In countries like France, women are routinely provided with perineal training for 6 weeks to strengthen the pelvic floor postpartum. This is a practice that can greatly reduce the risk of complications such as urinary incontinence and fecal incontinence. And birthing trauma is actually directly correlated to why somebody might choose assisted care living later on in life. So if we can take care of a woman early on and provide early intervention, we will be able to help the potential for disability later on in life. I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Now, I want to talk about pelvic floor therapy and what it is, because a lot of people don't know what it is. OB-GYNs don't even know what it is, and they're prescribing it. And I think that's so interesting that there's still so little that's known about what we can do. I would say it's like no different than treating a biceps injury. Like if you have a bicep strain, what a PT will do is work on it, work on the tissue to help bring blood flow to the area, will help strengthen the structure, will help strengthen it in a way that it integrates it with functional movement. We might make behavioral changes to help improve somebody's ergonomic setup in case they're injuring themselves, and then we would create a home exercise program to help them maintain themselves. But this is really no different than the pelvic floor. It's just a different area, that's it. And we do the same things. We assess pelvic floor structures and core musculature internally and externally. We're assessing the muscular integrity of the pelvic floor. We're coordinating the pelvic floor with the core anatomy. We're also teaching, whether we might be teaching you to strengthen or relax, or both. We're introducing these patterns into functional living and providing behavioral education to help you create an exercise program for maintenance thereafter. So really, it's no different. It's just there's stigma associated with this area. And so I just want to highlight some of the things that PTs do. We use manual therapy and exercise. We can provide sleep, stress, and behavioral management. We can, provide light nutritional and supplement education. So that's what PTs do. And if we are meeting somebody that we need more from, then we can always refer to mental health counseling if somebody needs psychotherapy, and medical doctors if they need medications or other interventions. So there's a lot that we can do in taking care of a woman at this fragile time. So now we're going to do it. We're going to Kegel. And I bring up Kegel and Liegig, and that's just Kegel spelled backwards. So it was just me being clever. But what I'd like you to see here, if Michelle, you want to come up with the pelvis. So you can see the pelvic sling, how it's attached to the pubic bone and the coccyx. And being attached to the pubic bone and the coccyx, you can see how it's slung up against our urethra, which is the yellow structure, our vagina, which is the pink structure, and the rectum, and the anus and the rectum, which is the brown structure. And so when people think about Kegling, they always think about vaginal contractions, but they're not just vaginal contractions, they're also rectoanal contractions. And so when you're thinking about Kegling, and we're gonna all do it together, you're gonna pull your pubic bone to your tailbone and pull upward as strongly as you can. That's the Kegel, pelvic floor activation. You might lose it and have to do it again and again and again, like me. And so I'm doing it. But now as you release it, that's called the Liegig. That's the reverse Kegel. And if you bulge out, that's also a form of a Liegig as well. And so PTs are sometimes just assessing what that strength integrity is and how much resistance there is to that passive stretch or on the Liegig. And those are two important metrics that we use as a PT. Now, because COVID hit and we had to treat women online during that time through telehealth, that was really tricky to treat women that were postpartum. When we had to assess them, we couldn't really assess them online. We didn't really know how to do that. So I had developed these tools that allow us to just sort of do what we just did together and put numbers to it. And that allowed really a lot of communication because we don't necessarily need to go into a room and evaluate you digitally. We can also just rely on your subjective impression of how strong you feel and how weak you might feel and be able to determine what the right intervention is for you. Michelle and I have also been working on a course for pelvic floor for new mothers. And this is a free course that we offer to women because we do believe that all females deserve to have the right to access to this information. This is not just for any one particular group of females. This should be available to all females everywhere. And so that's become our mission.
So these are pictures I took from my phone when I was in Rome, and I was at the Contemporary Art Museum. The sculpture was made in early 1900, and I was just taken by the sadness of this image, that this is the presentation of a woman that's gone through menopause as the opposite to what we just saw of the young mother. And I believe it's a Russian artist. The name is in the back of the references. And I really was moved by the idea of this is showing that she's basically not worthwhile to the world anymore as a symbol, because she's not fertile, and which will lead into what our next discussion is about.
So menopause, I think we need to reframe the conversation around menopause and start embracing women's wisdom. So names for menopause have been women's inferno, death of sex, women's winter. As women enter menopause, it's essential to shift this dialogue from negative narratives to positive ones, like women's wisdom, time for self-satisfaction. By reframing menopause, we can help women embrace this time with confidence and clarity. According to the North American Menopause Society, 1.1 billion women will be experiencing postmenopausal symptoms in 2025. It's 1/8 of the world. And yet, there's so little data. The staggering number highlights that there's a need to better understand and support women during this significant life transition. So like 2 years ago or 3 years ago, I read this article in the New York Times, and it was talking about the grandmother hypothesis. Does anybody here know what that is? Okay. It was a very grim article, actually. I didn't love the way that this was phrased. It was talking about how humans are amongst very few species that continue to live beyond the fertile window. And the purpose of humans to live beyond the fertile window is called the grandmother hypothesis, because women are meant to help teach the new mothers how to mother the future generations. So, and this also applies to orcas and pilot whales. So, we're amongst good company. I think that we need to shift the narrative so that we don't look at a woman's value based on the end of her fertile window, rather how the woman will continue to contribute to society through creativity, leadership, information. There's so much value, and I think that just reading that article made me realize that there's so much about language that we need to change, and we can change it together right away, today.
And also, if you look at the history of all women artists, the most famous women artists all became famous way past menopause. There is an actual complete correlation about this. So Georgia O'Keeffe, Mary Cassatt, Agnes Martin, you can just go down the list. None of them were accepted or revered until they were very, very old, actually. And Louise Bourgeois said, the art world loves young men and old women. So I'm looking forward to that.
It's like you literally have segued into my next comment, because there are two female artists in their 90s, and I quote them. The one woman I met who is into aesthetic realism told me that the reason why COVID didn't kill her was because she was still too curious about life. Mm-hmm. Another woman who sadly passed away in her 90s said that she just had still so much art to produce. Mm-hmm. Like she couldn't keep up with what she needed to produce, mm-hmm. and she wasn't finished. Absolutely. So, it sort of segued perfectly into these two women who were in their 90s and still producing art and being a valuable member of our community. I'm going to go into some more medical terms. What natural menopause is, it occurs when menstruation ceases for 12 consecutive months, around 50 to 51. Surgical menopause is the result of the removal of ovaries, and medical menopause is caused by treatments that are like harsh drugs, like chemotherapy drugs, can cause a woman to cease her menstrual cycle. So the word perimenopause, I think, is commonly known. Before entering menopause, women can experience perimenopausal symptoms up to 10 years before they actually go through menopause. And during this phase, women can experience hot flushes, sleep disturbances, weight gain, sexual difficulties, migraines, and mood fluctuations. Common health risks include diabetes, heart disease, urinary tract infections, dementia, osteoporosis. I mean, the endocrine system is very complex. Estrogen alone is influenced by the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the adrenals, testosterone, gut enzymes. It's a very, very mixed bag. And so I say that if you're experiencing any of these symptoms, just go to your gynecologist or even an endocrinologist. So a lot of people don't know that they can go to an endocrinologist as well, or your internist, and try to get a proper workup. And there's lots of resources that I can provide to you afterwards what that workup might need to look like. Despite the widespread occurrence of all of these conditions, there's just remains a considerable gap in menopause-related research. There's a 17-year hiatus, as I mentioned. The HRT study didn't really help. And as of 2020, only 10.8% of NIH funding was dedicated to women's health research. As PTs, the one big takeaway point that I would love to sort of relay during this phase of the cycle is the importance of resistance training. And I want to emphasize that. There have been several studies. One notes that exercising 2 times 10 reps at 85% of what we perceive as maximal. So this is like heavier loading than one might predict. Like, it's not the 3-pound weights in the bar class. But 85% of what you perceive as maximal in every muscle group's done twice a week is really what's recommended. And it's not like I'm telling you to start there. Don't start there. Find somebody who's a trained professional that can help you get to that level, but resistance training is really important. Jenny Doctorow, who's here, I think she's here, she may have left. Oh, she left to park her car. So she is also on our website, and she works with women above the age of 65, and she's an amazing personal trainer, so you can always just reach out to her on our website. But basically, resistance training can help with bone density, with muscle mass, managing weight, mental health, managing mental health issues, all helping through the regulation of this complexity in the endocrine system. So menopause represents a new chapter in a woman's life rather than an ending. By recognizing the complexities and advocating for health strategies, such as resistance training, hormone balance, and early intervention, really starting sooner, not when menopause hits, but during peri-symptoms, can empower women to navigate this phase with confidence and insight.
Mm-hmm. And this is a painting of mine, and I do make paintings as well, but I don't consider them paintings because they're painted on glass, they're on mirrors. It's hard to see them in an image, which is also why I like them, because sculpture is hard to see in an image as well. You have to be there in person to actually really experience it, which is also another whole thing I think about, where sculpture is more like the female body, where it's tied to the earth, and a painting is more like the male body, where it's a soul that's kind of running around in an imaginary space. So my husband's a painter, so we have these conversations all the time. So this is, I went through a period of trying to make a drawing of Aunt Pitty Pat from Gone with the Wind in early 2000. I have no idea why. I got obsessed with the idea that she was like dressed like a little girl, but she was an old woman, and it was before September 11th, and I started getting into Rococo for other reasons of why Rococo was a precursor to the fall and the revolutions that were coming, and the idea of these dualities of looking like everyone's eating cake, which I was talking about Marie Antoinette, and then the world was crumbling, which I think now is very prevalent in our world. And I got fixated on much older women dressing up and looking really, really like the grand dames. And this was Barbara Hepworth, who was, I think, a writer. And I hired 6 women over the age of 75 through a modeling agency that the designer Cynthia Rowley told me about, that specialized in older women, and I cast them. They came in for the modeling kind of interview, and I had them professionally photographed in very ornate dresses that I borrowed from the Metropolitan Opera, actually, with wigs and the whole deal. And I did a couple years of paintings of these women, but originally I was trying to make them as drawings on a mirror, because I wanted it to be that you were looking at them as they were looking at you. The idea of the mirror was very important. And the mirror itself is a duality, because it's both reflective and dark at the same time. It has both positive and negative, and dark and light, and all these beautiful dualities in itself. So anyway, we wanted to end on a beautiful note of the wonderfulness of knowing what you know at this age, and also enjoying yourself and being all about life, which is how we wanted to finish the images.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. We're going to send the video out to all y'all. So thank you again. Enjoy. There's more time, I think. But